It's the dead of night in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The year is 1943, and the sea is in an absolute rage, waves crashing 15 feet high, wind howling across the surface, and darkness so thick you can barely see your own hand in front of your face. Somewhere out in that chaos, two vessels are about to find each other. One is an American destroyer. The other is a German U-boat. And what's about to happen between them is something that military historians still talk about decades later, because this wasn't just a battle. This was one of the most savage, up-close, and brutally personal naval confrontations of the entire Second World War. We're talking about sailors throwing kitchen knives at each other across the deck of a submarine. We're talking about a destroyer intentionally ramming a U-boat at full speed. We're talking about men fighting hand-to-hand in the pitch black, in the middle of a storm, on the surface of one of the deadliest stretches of ocean on the planet. This is the story of the USS Bory, U-405, and a night that neither side would ever forget. To understand just how extraordinary this encounter was, you first need to understand the world these men were living in. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had been raging for over 4 years. It was the longest continuous military campaign of the entire Second World War, and it was utterly brutal. German U-boats had been tearing through Allied shipping lanes like wolves through a flock of sheep, sinking merchant vessels, supply ships, and troop transports by the hundreds. Entire convoys were wiped out. Thousands of sailors lost their lives in freezing waters far from shore. The North Atlantic was, without exaggeration, one of the most dangerous places on Earth during those years. The Allied response was to form hunter-killer groups, task forces built specifically around escort carriers and destroyers whose sole job was to track down and destroy U-boats before they could reach the convoys. These weren't defensive operations. They were offensive ones. The mission was to go out into the open ocean and hunt. The USS Bory was a Clemson-class destroyer, an older vessel by the standards of 1943, but still a capable and well-armed warship. She carried a crew of 122 men, and on the night in question, she was operating as part of one of these hunter-killer groups in the North Atlantic. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Charles Harris Hutchins, just 30 years old, but already a man who'd earned the respect of his crew. Hutchins was sharp, aggressive, and instinctive. He had the kind of tactical mind that could process a chaotic situation quickly and commit to a decision without hesitation. Those qualities were about to be tested in ways he couldn't have imagined. On the other side of this encounter was U-405, a Type VIC U-boat, the most common and most successful class of submarine in the German fleet. She was commanded by Korvettenkapitän Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann, an experienced officer with a crew of 45 men. The Type VIC was a formidable machine, armed with torpedoes, a powerful 88mm deck gun, and multiple anti-aircraft cannons. In the right circumstances, a U-boat like U-405 could devastate a surface vessel before it even got close. But on the night of November 1st, 1943, the circumstances were anything but right for Hauptmann and his crew. The U-boat was surfaced, riding the surface of the ocean to recharge its batteries, which was a necessity for submarines of that era. They ran on diesel engines on the surface and electric motors underwater, and those electric batteries needed regular recharging. It was a vulnerable time. A surface submarine loses all of its greatest advantages: stealth, depth, the ability to disappear. And on that particular night, surfacing would prove to be the beginning of a catastrophic chain of events. It was just past 1 in the morning when the radar operator aboard the USS Bory picked up something. A contact approximately 8,000 yards away. In the darkness, with waves battering the hull and the storm making visibility almost zero, the radar was their eyes. Hutchins didn't hesitate. He ordered the ship to turn and gave the command for flank speed, meaning maximum power, everything the engines had. The Bory surged forward through those massive 15-foot swells, pushing hard toward the contact. Meanwhile, deep inside U-405, the situation was changing fast. The hydrophone operator, the crew member responsible for listening to underwater sounds through sensitive equipment, picked up something alarming. high-speed propellers. The distinctive, churning sound of a surface warship moving at full speed, bearing down from the east. Hauptmann knew immediately that there were no friendly vessels anywhere near their position. Whatever was out there, it wasn't German. The alarm rang through the submarine. 45 men scrambled into action with the practiced urgency of a crew that had drilled this moment hundreds of times. Prepare to dive. Man battle stations. The U-boat began its descent beneath the surface, slipping away from the radar contact that had locked onto it, and for a moment, it seemed like Hauptmann's crew might escape cleanly into the deep. Back on the Bori, the radar screen went blank. The contact had vanished. The U-boat had submerged. Hutchins understood exactly what this meant. The Germans knew they were being hunted, and now the entire dynamic of the engagement had shifted. This was no longer a straightforward chase. This was a cat-and-mouse game in the dark, in a storm, on the open ocean, with lives on both sides hanging in the balance. Hutchins slowed the ship and called for sonar. The sonar system worked by sending out pulses of sound and listening for the echo that bounced back off a submerged hull. It was their only way to track the U-boat now. The sonar operators worked carefully, sweeping through the water, and then they found it. A contact 2,000 yards out. Hutchins ordered a course to intercept. Aboard U-405, the hydrophone operator was trying to do the same thing in reverse, tracking the Bori by listening to her propellers and her sonar pulses. But the information wasn't precise enough to fire a torpedo accurately. What he could tell with growing alarm was that the American ship was getting closer. The sonar pings were louder, more frequent, more insistent. The Americans were right on top of them. Hutchins pushed the attack. The sonar trace was pulling closer, and the crew readied the depth-charge launchers, large cylindrical canisters packed with high explosives that were set to detonate at a specific depth. The idea was to drop them as close to the submarine as possible and let the shockwave do the damage. At 600 yards, the order was given to prepare the launchers. At 500, the sonar contact slipped beneath the keel. The U-boat had passed directly underneath the Bori. Hutchins ordered a hard turn to bring the stern around, swinging the depth-charge racks toward the target. The charges flew off the racks, arced through the stormy air, and crashed into the ocean right alongside U-405's bow. The detonations were enormous. The shockwave hammered the forward section of the submarine like a fist. Inside, the crew were thrown off their feet, equipment rattled loose, and almost immediately the damage reports started coming in. Water was flooding into the bow compartment. At depth, with the pressure of the ocean working against them, there was no way to stop it. Hauptmann had no choice. He ordered the U-boat to surface and to man the guns the moment they broke the water. When U-405 burst through the surface of the Atlantic, it was a dramatic and violent sight. The submarine came up hard and fast, water cascading off the hull in great sheets, the storm still raging around it. The Bori's crew had already turned on their searchlight, and within seconds the beam found the U-boat, illuminating it in stark white light against the dark ocean. German sailors were already pouring out of the hatches, moving fast, moving with purpose, rushing to man the anti-aircraft cannons mounted on the submarine's deck. The 20mm guns opened up almost immediately. Shells streaked across the water and slammed into the Bori's hull and superstructure. American sailors ducked and scrambled for cover as the impacts rang through the ship. The Germans were fighting hard, and they knew their best chance of survival was to get their more powerful 88mm deck gun into action. That weapon could punch through a destroyer's hull and cause serious damage, potentially fatal damage. Hutchins knew it too. He immediately ordered all of the Bori's guns to open fire in local control, meaning the individual gun crews would aim and fire independently rather than waiting for centralized direction. It was a way of getting maximum fire onto the target as fast as possible. The first salvos overshot the U-boat, splashing into the water beyond. But the gunners adjusted quickly, and within moments the Bori's own 20mm cannons were finding their mark. Shells raked across U-405's forward deck, the forecastle, right where the 88mm gun was positioned, and where German sailors were desperately trying to bring it into action. The results were devastating. The gun crew was cut down. Replacements rushed up from below, brave men willing to take the place of their fallen comrades, but they didn't last either. One after another, German sailors reached the big gun and tried to aim it, only to find themselves staring down the barrels of the Bory's main armament. The shells that followed were merciless. By the time the smoke cleared, the 88mm gun and its entire crew were gone, destroyed completely, washed away into the churning Atlantic. But here was the problem. Even without the big gun, U-405 was still afloat. Hutchins knew that gunfire alone wasn't going to send his submarine to the bottom. He needed something more decisive, something final. And so he made a decision that, in any other context, would seem absolutely extraordinary. He ordered his helmsman to ram the U-boat. The USS Bory accelerated to 27 knots and drove directly into the side of U-405. The impact was enormous. The collision buckled the Bory's bow, and the force of it sent men stumbling across both decks. Deep in the destroyer's engineering spaces, water began pouring in through the cracks and ruptures in the hull. Chief Engineer Kenneth Miles Lucas and his damage control teams rushed to assess the situation, and what they found was serious. The Bory was taking on water and fast. But on the deck of the U-boat, something even more remarkable was happening. With the two vessels locked together in the storm, German sailors began pouring out of the hatches to fight, and the Americans met them. What followed was something almost medieval in its nature, a close-quarters brawl on the rolling, wave-swept decks of two warships locked together in the middle of a storm. American sailors grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Tommy guns, pistols, and rifles for some, but for others it was flare pistols, heavy shell casings, entire unfired shells used as clubs, and yes, kitchen knives. Whatever was within reach became a weapon. The Americans had the advantage of elevation. The destroyer's deck sat higher than the submarines, and they had better cover. The flat, exposed deck of the U-boat offered the German sailors almost nowhere to hide. They fought with incredible determination, but the odds were stacked against them. One by one, the defenders of U-405 fell. Some were cut down by gunfire. Others were swept off the deck by the storm and lost to the sea. By the time the two vessels finally broke apart, U-405 was still somehow afloat and her engines were still running, but the human cost had been catastrophic. U-405 managed to pull free from the Bory's grasp, her engines straining as Hauptmann fought to put distance between his stricken submarine and the American destroyer. But the Bory wasn't finished. Even with water flooding into her forward compartments, even with her crew exhausted and her hull damaged, Hutchins wasn't ready to let the U-boat go. Lucas and his engineering team were performing near miracles in the flooded compartments below, keeping the turbines running despite conditions that were becoming increasingly dangerous. The ship was heavy now, hundreds of tons of seawater filling spaces that should have been air, but she was still moving, still fighting. Hutchins attempted to fire a torpedo at the retreating U-boat. The weapon launched cleanly, cut through the water on a direct course, and missed. The battle wasn't over yet. Aboard U-405, Hauptmann was facing a grim reality. His submarine was seriously damaged, his crew had been decimated, and only 15 of his original 45 men were still alive and functional. But Hauptmann wasn't ready to surrender either. He ordered his remaining crew to turn the submarine around and prepare to fire torpedoes at the Bory. It was a desperate move, a last attempt to turn the tables on an enemy that had beaten them at every turn. Hutchins saw the U-boat turning. He understood immediately what was happening. And in a moment of cool tactical brilliance, he ordered his crew to cut the searchlight. The ocean went dark. Aboard U-405, the sudden disappearance of the blinding light created momentary confusion. Hauptmann, perhaps believing the Americans had turned away or were preparing to withdraw, made a decision. He aborted the torpedo attack and ordered the submarine to turn to starboard, attempting to use the darkness to escape. It was exactly what Hutchins had been counting on. The Bory's radar had never lost track of U-405. The moment the submarine committed to its turn, Hutchins ordered the searchlight back on, and there was U-405, illuminated and vulnerable, right in front of them. He ordered a second ramming attempt. The U-boat maneuvered desperately, managing to slip past the Bore's bow, but in doing so, it presented its stern to the destroyer's depth charge racks. Hutchins ordered the charges fired. The canisters launched, arced through the night air, and fell perfectly around the submarine. The detonations that followed were final. U-405's hull, already stressed and damaged from everything it had been through, was breached beyond any possibility of repair. The submarine was finished. The ocean went quiet except for the wind and the waves. Then flares began rising from the stricken U-boat, the internationally recognized signal of surrender. The remaining survivors of U-405, 15 men, including Hopman, made their way out of the submarine and into life rafts, floating in the dark Atlantic while the Bore moved to approach them. And then everything got worse. A lookout on the Bore spotted a flare in the distance, and almost immediately after, the call that every sailor dreads, a torpedo in the water. Another U-boat, presumably drawn by the sound of the battle, had arrived and was firing. Hutchins had no choice. He had to maneuver immediately. He ordered the ship to turn its stern toward the incoming torpedo to present the thinnest possible profile, but that maneuver sent the Bore directly through the area where the German survivors were floating in their life rafts. With the torpedo closing in, there was no time to stop, no time to turn back. The Bore had to move or be sunk. The 15 survivors of U-405, including their captain, were left behind in the dark water of the North Atlantic. The rescue that Hutchins had hoped to organize never came. Every single man from U-405 was lost to the ocean that night. It's one of the more painful footnotes of the entire engagement. Men who had surrendered, men who had survived everything the battle had thrown at them, ultimately lost not to enemy fire but to the cruel, indifferent sea. The USS Bore had won the engagement. U-405 was gone, but the Bore herself was dying. The flooding that had begun with the first ramming could not be controlled. Lucas and his engineering teams had performed extraordinary work, keeping the ship functional throughout the battle, at times literally diving into flooded spaces to operate valves and maintain the engines. But the damage was simply too great. Eventually, with water rising faster than it could be managed, Lucas ordered his men to evacuate the engineering spaces through the roof hatches. The order came to abandon ship. The crew of the Bore went into the same North Atlantic waters that had just claimed the men of U-405. The storm was still raging. The seas were still enormous. Out of 122 crew members aboard the USS Bore, 27 men did not survive long enough for rescue ships to reach them. They were lost to hypothermia, to the waves, to the sheer unforgiving nature of that stretch of ocean. It was a devastating loss, men who had fought brilliantly and won, only to be taken by the sea itself. Those who survived were eventually rescued and returned to Allied hands. Both Hutchins and Lucas survived the war. Lieutenant Commander Charles Harris Hutchins was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during that engagement, one of the United States Navy's highest honors. The citation recognized not just his courage, but his tactical ingenuity, his decisive action under fire, and his willingness to put himself and his ship in harm's way to destroy the enemy. The story of the USS Bore and U-405 sits in a very particular corner of World War II naval history, not one of the great fleet engagements or the famous convoy battles, but something far more intimate and far more raw. This was two ships fighting each other at arm's length, in the dark, in a storm, with their crews brawling hand-to-hand on each other's decks. It's the kind of encounter that strips away all the abstraction of naval warfare and reveals it for what it actually was at its most brutal: human beings, terrified and determined in equal measure, doing whatever it took to survive. What makes this story stick more than anything else is the sheer improbability of it. The ramming, the deck fight, the kitchen knives, the tactical deception with the searchlight, the torpedo that missed, the survivors left in the water. Every element of that night sounds like something invented for a war film, and yet every element of it is documented history. It happened, Men lived it, and some of them died it. The North Atlantic claimed a lot during those years. Sailors on both sides of the conflict. Ships that took years to build, gone in minutes. Young men with whole lives ahead of them, swallowed by cold water far from home. The Bory and U-405 added their names to that long, sorrowful list, but they also left behind a story that deserves to be remembered. A story of what naval combat really looked like when it got close enough to be personal. So the next time you think about World War II at sea, and your mind goes to the great battles, Midway, the sinking of the Bismarck, the convoys crossing the Atlantic, spare a thought for the smaller stories too. The ones that happened in the dark, in the storm, far from any audience, where ordinary men made extraordinary decisions under impossible pressure. The USS Bory went out one night to hunt a submarine, and what she found instead was one of the most ferocious and unusual naval battles in the history of the war. She won that fight at great cost, and then the ocean took her anyway. Hutchins, Lucas, and the survivors carry that night with them for the rest of their lives. And the men who didn't make it home, American and German alike, deserve to be remembered as the human beings they were, not just as statistics in a war that produced them by the millions. If this kind of history is what you come here for, real stories told straight, without exaggeration, then make sure you're subscribed, because there are many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Drop a comment below and let us know what part of this engagement hit you hardest. And if you know someone who loves this kind of history, share this with them. These stories deserve a wider audience.